Sweet. Yeah, Hadas, if you'd like to share your slides and your screen, we are super ready and excited.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Can you still it says host disabled attendee screen sharing, but I think there's probably a way to
Oh,
turn it
all
on.
participants. There you go.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Can you still see them now that they're in slideshow mode?
Yeah, they're like
Okay, awesome.
perfectly
So I'm going to go through this. I can't see the Zoom screen anymore. So if you have a question, speak up. I won't be able to see raised hands. I have a Linux computer, so the Zoom configuration is not ideal. But anyway, okay. So yeah, this is a presentation on Basefold. I go pretty heavy with the background of coding-based polynomial commitment scheme, so I hope that's okay. But if you feel like I'm talking too much about things you already know, let me know. So to start, a generic recipe for a snark is to take a circuit that's specified by some code to compile it into an arithmetic circuit, which can be represented like this, like a tree, and then to convert it to a set of polynomials. And so basically at a very high level, the circuit can be defined as a set of polynomials, and the witness can also be defined as a set of polynomials. And the prover's task then becomes to commit to a polynomial in a way that is binding and prove that the polynomial that underlies the commitment evaluates to a claimed point at some point that the verifier queries. So the prover will submit a binding commitment to P, which right now isn't defined at all. It's just sort of a data structure that represents P, that we have some guarantee on it being linked to exactly one polynomial. The verifier will send an evaluation point that it wants to know. It wants to know where P evaluates at B. And then the prover will send the evaluation H and a proof that the polynomial that the commitment is bound to actually does evaluate to H at B. And then the verifier will verify that proof. And so we have a few security requirements for these. One is completeness, which says that if the prover is honest, then the verifier will always accept the proof. That seems pretty trivial, but it's possible sometimes that's not even the case. And requiring schemes to be complete is still a constraint on them. The other one is soundness, which is arguably more important, which says a malicious prover will have their proofs rejected with high probability. And then another sort of more philosophical requirement is knowledge soundness, which is saying that there's no way that a prover could come up with a commitment that is accepting if it doesn't actually know a polynomial that is a proper witness. And that's sort of hard to wrap your head around, because it seems like, how could a prover produce a commitment if it doesn't already know a polynomial? But I suppose there are ways that it could cleverly construct something that the verifier would accept, even without having a satisfying polynomial. And so we have this extra property, which is formalized by saying that we have some efficient computer program, the efficient extractor, that has black box access to a prover with the same witness, and it can query it any number of times. And as long as the prover wins most of the time, then we can extract the polynomial. So maybe one way to view this is if you had like a cloud compute service, and the prover is in the cloud compute service and is proving to you that the program you submitted was actually executed correctly. And if you were to query it many, many, many times, and if it is an honest prover, like most of the time, then you should be able to extract the underlying program. So our desired efficiency properties. So the polynomial commitment scheme, even though it's only a building block of a snark, actually ends up being a pretty big bottleneck. So if you can get your PCS to be fast, then your snark will be much more efficient than if your PCS is not fast, although it's not the only bottleneck, but it is one of them. So our end goal down the line is to see if it's possible to get a prover with small constant overhead over the time of the computation. So obviously when you're proving a computation, you can't hope to do better than the time that computation would take on its own. But we can hope to do basically that good. So we would hope maybe at most twice as slow as that, for example. And then additionally, we want a small constant proof size. Because if you're actually computing, if you were just computing a program with no zero knowledge proof, your proof size is 0. So we want a proof size that is as close to 0, or your proof size is the output of the computation, maybe. So we want as small of a proof size as possible. And then we also want a small constant verifier time, ideally, but this doesn't exist yet. Currently, there is this trade-off between verifier costs and prover costs. Sorry, there's a typo in this graph here. This is supposed to be prover time. So basically, the schemes that have very small proof size have very large prover time. The schemes that currently have small proof size, large verifier time. Schemes that have a large proof size have small prover time. And then in the middle, this is FRI here, has okay proof size, okay proving time. And so it kind of gets in the middle. The blue one is like KZG, things that use cryptographic assumptions like discrete log assumption. These also have other drawbacks like requiring a trusted setup. Over here are schemes like breakdown and Ligero. They have a large proof size, but very, very fast prover time. And then here is FRI, which has a pretty fast prover. Smaller proof size than breakdown and Ligero, but not as small as what you get from using a discrete log assumption. And then there's other efficiency properties we might aim for that are more concrete efficiency rather than asymptotic. And so field agnosticity is a big one. You always avoid non-native field operations this way, which is sort of equivalent, if you think about it, to being able to decide the word size of your hardware. So as you see, and this kind of links to this one. So here we use field agnosticity is important because you can use the field with the most efficient implementation in hardware. This is why Goldilocks and Baby Bear are Mersenne prime fields. Sorry, it's because Mersenne prime fields are like 2 to the 31 minus 1 is really efficient because it can be represented by a small word in hardware. But then the other benefit is being able to prove, for example, signature verification circuits without non-native field operations. So that ends up, you use like many less constraints, maybe like 1 over 32 fraction of constraints when you can avoid non-native field operations. So you get a huge speed up for certain applications. Okay, so I'm going to go into coding-based polynomial commitment schemes. Sorry, let me pause here. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, can you go to the last slide again?
Yeah.
Can you go a little bit deeper into non-native field operations?
Yes. So essentially, the idea here, so this is why it's similar to hardware. If your application requires arithmetic modulo a prime p, like for example, in a signature verification circuit, if you're using like a curve that is appropriate for the signature scheme, you need to do all your operations in the field like z mod p for some p, right? But let's say that your proof system uses a different prime q to do its arithmetic. So what you have to do is basically for every like operation, you can't. So usually in a circuit, if the prime that the application is over is equivalent to the prime that the proof system is over, every multiplication is just one arithmetic constraint. You don't have to do the modulo operator inside the circuit. So that doesn't lead to constraints because all of the arithmetic is already modulo P of that correct prime. But if you have a different modulus, then you actually have to do the modulus operation inside the snark circuit.
I see.
And so that adds a lot of constraints to do that.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you.
It is similar. I don't know if this is a helpful analogy, but it is like, so as you know, on computers, like there are certain word sizes and hardware is automatically doing arithmetic modulo that word size. Like you don't, if you're just programming non-cryptographic applications, you usually don't have to deal with this. But if you do try to do arithmetic over very big numbers that are like greater than 2 to the 32, for example, when you're on a 32-bit word, it will overflow and just do the modulus operation automatically. And that's super fast because it's in hardware. But if you're doing cryptography and then you have to do modulus over a different number, it gets slow because you have to actually, write out you have to do more operations. So it's analogous to that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to go into coding-based polynomial commitment schemes. So an error-correcting code, you can just think of it as a list of strings where every 2 strings are guaranteed to have at least D positions where they differ. So I put these blocks here with different colors. So for example, this compared to this, the first and the second have the same color. The third and the fourth are different colors. The fifth and the sixth have the same color. So this would have a Hamming distance of 2. And then this one has a Hamming distance of 2 as well. So you could say the minimum distance of this code is 2. And basically that is useful because it provides a metric space. And you can think of like what we're used to thinking of in Euclidean space. Like if you and your friend are standing far apart from each other, you have a notion of what distance means there. So this is the same thing, but just with a different definition for distance. And it makes it possible to, it gives meaning to the ability to test that something is in a space. If you can assign sort of locations and positions to them. But okay, so it turns out that evaluations of polynomials over certain domains have large minimum distance and are therefore make good codes. So you can think of, for example, Reed-Solomon codes are univariate polynomials evaluated at different points. A code word is just a set of evaluations. And if you were thinking it in Euclidean space instead of Hamming space, you can literally just think of it as like a graph. This is like a parabola, or this is a quadratic equation on a graph. Each of these points are evaluations of a polynomial. So you could think of this as a visualization of a code word. And then we have the notion of testing proximity to a code. So as I was saying, because we have this notion of distance, we can have a notion of testing proximity to this. And maybe one physical analogy is, imagine that you're on a playground and you have a bunch of like basketballs that are all within, like are all at a specific position. So let's say you place the basketball 5 feet apart from each of them. So you lay out basketballs in this pattern where each is 5 feet apart from any other one around it. And then let's say that there are a bunch of little kids around that can only kick a certain distance because they're small. And they run around and they're kicking the balls. You would want a way to take a ball that has been kicked and ask, did this used to be in the position that I laid the balls out into? So it's this idea that if you already know that you have a set of strings or a set of vectors that are in very specific positions, then even if you get something that is not exactly there, you can still link it back to the closest one. So the goal, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I think Thor has a question, but
Okay.
he has his hand raised, but you can answer whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my question was basically, you said two things that I wanted to ask about. One is specifically that polynomial codes have, over certain domains, have large minimum distance. Is that the bitwise distance, as in like the number of non-matching bits between the polynomial evaluation of P of 1 and P of 2, for instance? And the second thing, you said that proximity tests to a polynomial code is happening on this slide. The question here is the question whether that 5 is the evaluation of point x1 and 10 is the evaluation of point x2, or is it that those are close to the evaluation of x1 or x2?
No, so yeah, that's okay. So let me answer your first question first. Yes, it is the bitwise distance, although maybe not over bits. So it could be over field elements, but it's the position-wise distance. Does that make sense?
Is that the bitwise distance of the encoding of the field element, or?
No, it's not. It's like if you had a set of evaluations, like imagine that this here is a set of evaluations of one polynomial, and then you have another set of evaluations of a different polynomial. Here, it's the square-wise distance between them. So we have a guarantee that, like, at most 3 of these will be the same between 2 encodings.
Sorry, how did you get to the most 3? Is that
Sorry,
the
that's
degree
an
of the
example.
polynomial?
That's an example, but actually it should be about half. So for univariate polynomials, like Reed-Solomon codes, let's say it has block length 2. I mean, like the rate, the inverse of the rate, the block length is twice the size of the message. Then, yeah, then the minimum distance is just 1 less than half. So, yeah, so you would have at least, in this case, you'd have at least 2 being different. But yeah, to answer your question about bitwise distance, hold on, let me. If you imagine that this is a polynomial, a set of polynomial evaluations, and this is another set of polynomial evaluations, we would say that this has a distance of 2 from each other because there's 2 positions that are different.
Because the polynomial disagrees at the evaluations over some domain.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah, exactly. And then to answer your question on this slide, yeah, the question here is, for each element, is P, the polynomial P evaluated at x1 equal to 5? Is the polynomial evaluated at x2 equal to 10? But the relaxation that you were mentioning happens when you talk about all of them. So what we want to know is, can we answer yes to most of these questions? So we're not going to be able to test exact proximity of a code word sublinearly or like efficiently. For that, you'd have to check every single element of the code word. But what we can do is get a probabilistic guarantee that most of them are evaluations. We won't know which ones necessarily, but we'll know that most of them are the correct evaluations of the polynomial.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Cool. Are there any other questions about this? Okay, cool. I'll move on. Right, so our goal is with very high probability, we can answer yes to most of these questions. And okay, so one way to visualize this is, again, going back to the graph. Imagine we're on Euclidean space and you just put a bunch of dots on a graph. We want to know, if you were to connect these dots, does it make a polynomial that has degree less than 2, for example? Here we could say, yeah, it does. Look, you can draw a degree 2 polynomial through most of the dots. There's one that isn't, but most of them, the answer is yes. Now, again, when we're talking about error correcting codes over Hamming distance, you can't, this is not exact because it's harder to visualize Hamming distance because it's discrete on a graph like this. But this is just to use, it's much easier to have intuition over the space that we live in, which is Euclidean space. So this is an analogy, but this is basically what's happening. Right, and then because of the Hamming distance that we established that like polynomial evaluations will have a certain minimum Hamming distance between them, we can have the sense of being able to say that some string is close to a unique, distinct polynomial. And the reason for that, so there's something called the unique decoding radius. And it's simply because we know that every two of these circles must be at least some distance apart from each other. We know that within half of that distance, it must be the only circle that exists there, because otherwise the minimum distance would be less. So because of that, this is how we get a binding commitment to the polynomial. It's because of the minimum Hamming distance and the unique decoding radius. So here we would say, okay, yeah, most of these are the evaluation of a polynomial called P2. And so therefore, we know if it's within the unique decoding radius that this is closest to P2 and no other polynomial. And if we wanted to, we could decode this thing to P2 by doing like polynomial interpolation, for example, and only P2. And so that's what gives us the binding property of this commitment. And so proximity tests to polynomials are important for that reason, because it allows us to commit to a polynomial and then use different techniques to then have to prove evaluation, but I'm not going to go into that as deeply. But we have the very famous FRI proximity test for Reed-Solomon codes, which has a small proof size, which I'm going to explain in a bit, because it has basically an interactive proof between a prover and a verifier, where the verifier only has to query some elements of the code word in order to determine whether it is a code word. It has just 5 n field multiplications, although then n log k, where k is the message size, n is the oracle size, to compute the low degree extension, which requires interpolation and then evaluation. But there's some limitations to FRI, which that it only works over very specific finite fields, which I'll explain in a second. And it's not, you have to use a generic univariate to multilinear PCS compilation to use FRI as a multilinear PCS. And multilinear polynomial commitment schemes have some advantage over univariate polynomial commitment schemes. And there are, like, for example, linear time snarks built for them. I believe they can have more expression in their circuits, so which leads to more efficiency, especially for certain applications. So yeah, so there's a reason to want multilinear polynomial commitment schemes, and there's some overhead to getting FRI to be one currently. So Basefold is very similar to FRI. It sort of generalizes FRI and then changes one aspect of the protocol. So it has also log squared n proof size, 5n prover time, and log 8 encoding time. It works over any finite field, so it lifts that limitation of FRI, as long as the finite field is sufficiently larger than the message size, because that's required to make sure that the minimum distance of the code is good. And Basefold yields a straightforward compilation from proximity test to multilinear PCS with only a 6K overhead, where K is the message size, which is a very small overhead. So those are benefits of Basefold. Okay, so I'm going to describe, sorry.
A quick question. Yeah, so when it comes to working over any finite field, I was wondering if there was, a potential implementation with Basefold for the binary tower polynomial commitment scheme. I can drop a link to it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I need to prove it formally, but I do think that Basefold could be a good candidate for using an extension field tower with, because especially in every encoding round of Basefold, you don't need the same field to be used between rounds as long as one is an extension field of the other. So I think it could be beneficial to slowly, maybe every few rounds, increase the field extension. And that might be efficient, especially over binary extension fields, and give good distance. So,
wow, really cool.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, but still need to check it formally. But yeah, I think that's a good direction.
I'd also like to ask if you would unpack precisely what you mean by 6K overhead.
Yeah, so that's from the sum check protocol, and K is the message size here. So for example, right, so what I mean is that you have the FRI, the Basefold IOPP, which is just 5n field multiplications, right? And then the n log k encoding time. And you do that, and then you have the guarantee that the oracle is close to evaluations of a multilinear polynomial. And then within that IOPP, we interleave the sum check protocol. So the overhead, all I mean is that there's an additional 6K finite field multiplications in the interactive oracle proof of proximity. But for example, FRI, the current FRI PCS has an additional, I think, 4 times n overhead, where n is the block length, is the entire message length. So for FRI, for example, if you were over rate 2, it would be 8K instead of 6K. But if you're over, but if you're over rate inverse rate of 4, it would be 16K instead of 6K. So and then that's just the FRI univariate test. So then for the FRI multilinear polynomial commitment scheme, that requires a compilation step that requires an extra 2 Reed-Solomon encodings. So for that, the overhead is n log k over the original IOPP. Does that answer your question?
I think I might be a bit out of my depth, but I think we might move on.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I may have mistargeted your question. Do you just mean the term overhead? What is that?
I was curious what you precisely meant by a 6K overhead to the compilation step.
I see. Yes, you're right. That's not stated super clearly. What I mean is a 6K overhead on top of the current FRI IOPP costs. Or sorry, IOPP, I haven't even said. Current 6K overhead over the current FRI test. So not over the compilation, but over FRI. So it's just FRI plus a little bit more computation, and you automatically get a multilinear PCS.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to go a little bit into Reed-Solomon codes because it will explain the intuition behind Basefold and the core idea. So basically, a Reed-Solomon code can be seen as a vector multiplied by a generator matrix. It's how any linear code can be seen as a vector matrix multiplication. But in Reed-Solomon codes, a generator matrix, which we call this, is the Vandermonde matrix. So each column is a different element of the domain, and each row is a different power. So as you can see, like any univariate polynomial, this would be, if your coefficients are ABC, it'd be ax1 plus ax1 squared plus, or ax1 plus bx1 squared plus cx1 cubed, ax2 plus bx2 squared plus cx2 cubed. So as you can see, these are just, this yields evaluations of univariate polynomials. In this case, it's degree 8 univariate polynomials. This is just, so that's why that's the encoding we're Reed-Solomon code. This is a Vandermonde matrix. Sorry, another slide of the same thing. Okay, but now this is the reason that FRI requires a cyclic group that is a power of 2 in size. Is because now what we do is we replace all the domain elements by some power of a generator of a cyclic group. So for those who don't know, cyclic groups are sets of numbers that have rich algebraic properties in the sense that you can identify an element such that every element in the group can be obtained by taking powers of just that one element. So in this case, G0, G to the power of 1, G to the power of 2, basically this whole first row, these are all of the elements of this set of numbers. And it's closed under multiplication. And so this is our new domain now. And these are all distinct. And so this just literally plugs these domain points into this matrix. And this ends up yielding cool symmetries, which I'll discuss now. So now what I've done is combine the powers. So if you take G to the power of 3 to the power of 2, you get G to the 2 times 3. So doing that. And now what we can do is split up the even and odd rows of the Vandermonde matrix. So for example, the top row is as it was. The second row multiplies the top row by a different element in each column. So 1 times G, 1 times G, 1 times 1, 1 times G, 1 times G squared, 1 times G cubed, 1 times G to the fourth. Okay, the third row is as it was. The fourth row, again, multiplies the row just before it by the same thing that the last white row did. So times g to the 0 times g squared times g cubed, etc. So as you can see, it's possible to then split the whites and the blues apart from each other, such that the blues are each multiplied by the same thing in each column. So the important thing to see here is that when you separate out the whites and the blues, each column in the whites is equal to the blues times g for the second column. And here, in the first column, let's say if you index from 0, here in the second column, the blues are all, the column of the blues is equal to the corresponding columns of the whites times g squared, and so on. So you can split it into two matrices where the blues is equal to the whites times some constant for each column. So that then corresponds to multiplication by a diagonal matrix. So this is kind of interesting. You can maybe do it in your head, but matrix multiplication would be, so if you were to multiply this, for example, the second row, first column, or let's say second row, second column, is this row times this. And the third row, second column is this row times this. And the fourth row, second column is this row times this. And what you'll end up seeing is that everything will zero out except for the elements that are in the second column here. So this is equivalent to multiplying each column by a specific thing. So again, the first column will be multiplied by 1. The second column will be multiplied by g. The third column will be multiplied by g squared. The fourth column will be multiplied by g cubed. And then the same is true over here, but now for different elements. Yeah, I realize we're almost at time, so maybe I should stop and ask for questions. Does that part make sense, or does anybody want clarification on that?
Makes sense.
Okay, cool. So I'll continue. I don't have that many slides left. Okay, so finally, you get to the fact that the Vandermonde generator matrix is actually has this block form. So you can have a matrix where you have block matrices composing it. So this is G times T1, G times T2, where T1 is this diagonal matrix and T2 is this diagonal matrix. And then Vandermonde matrices, so because it's a power of 2 cyclic subgroup is why you get this symmetry between the left and the right. And then G will also be of this form. So you can continuously decompose the matrix until you end up with a very small generator matrix. And the reason this is useful in the FRI proximity test is because you can, the encoding of, like, if this is a valid code word, then you'll be able to pair up elements like this. And it'll be of the form x1 plus t1x2, x1 plus t2x2, which are just 2 degree 1 like linear equations. You can interpolate them using standard Lagrange interpolation to get x1, x2, and then combine them to get an element in oracle 2. And so this is basically how FRI and how Basefold works, which is you take your first oracle, you partition them into pairs, you interpolate to get the constituents of the pairs, like the two summons, x1, x2, and then the verifier will send a random point and you'll just evaluate x1 plus rx2, which gives you a point in a code word of a smaller code. You continuously do that until you get to a code with constant size. And so the difference between Basefold proximity and FRI proximity is simply in the choices of the diagonal matrices T1 and T2. So now instead of using the generator,
Oh, Hadas, we can't hear you for some reason. The audio cut out. Hadas, we still can't hear you. Can you hear us? All good. Okay, sweet. Okay, we can hear you typing.
Oh, wait, really? Can you hear me
Yeah,
now?
we can hear you now. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah, maybe it's because I was sharing my screen. All right, let me try sharing again, but let me know if you.
That was just funky.
Yeah. Sorry, it's because my Linux computers have really weird audio kernel issues, so it's probably that. But all right, let me try again. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, I just have, that's actually my last slide. That's the Basefold proximity test. The idea is basically that we deconstructed the Reed-Solomon code into this and then just switched out the elements of this diagonal matrices. And that has the benefit of field agnosticity, which can have a lot of performance improvements. And we proved the minimum distance of that code. And then I guess what I didn't have time to get to is how we use that as a polynomial commitment scheme. So yeah, are there any questions?
Go on for a few more minutes if you want to like briefly touch on that. If you guys are
Okay, sure, yeah.
Sweet.
Okay, so oh, am I sharing right now? Wait, am I still sharing my screen? No. Okay, so basically the intuition behind why we can make this a polynomial commitment scheme, it actually doesn't have to do with this new code that we created. You can also do it with a Reed-Solomon code. But what it does have to do with is the structure of these matrices, because it turns out that matrices with these structures are already evaluations of multilinear polynomials. And the reason is that you can view a multilinear polynomial as just like iteratively creating linear equations. So like, for example, here we have x1 plus t1 x2, right? x1 plus t2 x2. From there, you get x1, x2. So in this case, what x1 and x2 really are evaluations of smaller multilinear polynomials. So let's see, for example, if you're doing a two-variant multilinear polynomial, it would be like axy plus bx plus cy plus d. And so then you can write that as y times ax plus c plus bx plus d. And you can look at ax plus c and bx plus d kind of as coefficients of a linear equation. So in this case, you could say x1 is equal to ax plus c, x2 is equal to bx plus d. You evaluate them at this random point. So this is kind of equivalent to doing a partial evaluation of this at r, where you place y with r. And then you get the new polynomial, ax plus r times bx plus d. And that's just a linear equation. And then, yeah, so then, right, because then you can write that as x times a times r plus b plus c plus d. And then you can, once again, interpolate these two. So these two would then have the same coefficients. And you would get ar plus b and c plus d. And then once again, in the next folding round, as we call it, you would be evaluating x at another random point. So then the last oracle, like let's say that this is called p of xy. the last oracle is going to be equal to P of R1, R2, where R1, R2 are the verifier queries. And that's very useful because we can then interleave it with the famous sum check protocol. So if you're familiar with the sum check protocol, you can it proves polynomial evaluation. The only thing you need is oracle access to a polynomial. So you need to be able to verifiably query an oracle and get back a polynomial evaluated at a random point. And so the key insight here is that the very last oracle of the FRI IOPP and the Basefold IOPP is an evaluation of P at a random point. So by interleaving the sum check protocol, which is also a multi-round protocol, with Basefold, you end up being able to prove evaluation binding and evaluation in that way. Are there any questions about that?
Maybe a sort of quick aside question about sum check. I had in my mental model that sum check is a proof that the sum of all evaluations of some polynomial over a domain is something. You said that sum check is a way to prove that a polynomial evaluates to something at some point. Could you maybe give a quick word on that?
Yeah, so you're right. The sum check protocol is much more generic than what I just said. But there is a way, because you can uniquely express a multilinear polynomial as the evaluations over the Boolean hypercube. And then there is a way to express the evaluation of that polynomial through a sum. So basically you have a sum of products where the product is the evaluation of the multilinear polynomial over each element of the Boolean hypercube, which is just Boolean vectors of zeros and ones, times some specific other polynomial that the verifier can create on its own. And so using that specific sum that is proven to equal to multilinear evaluation, you can use the sum check protocol to then prove evaluation. So you are essentially proving the result of a sum, but it's a very specific sum that is equal to this problem.
Maybe just one follow-on question. Is that a Lagrange polynomial? That is, you would take the polynomial in question, multiply it by a Lagrange polynomial, and then take the sum check over the domain?
Yes, yeah. Sorry,
Gotcha,
yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is. Yeah. Cool. Are there any other comments or questions? Or yeah, I guess I didn't touch a lot on like practical applications and stuff. So if you have questions around that, I'm also happy to answer.
Would be down to hear your thoughts on practical applications.
Cool, yeah. So I think Basefold will yield the most performance advantage as a multilinear PCS. So I think, yeah, so as a multilinear PCS, you can plug it into Hyperplonk or Spartan or proof systems like that. It's field agnostic, so it yields huge performance advantages for applications that require specific fields, like different cryptographic applications. So if you were going to build, I think a lot of zero-knowledge proof systems in general might require sort of interoperating across cryptographic primitives. So like if you want to decrypt something and then prove to someone that you decrypted it, or you want to verify a signature and prove to someone that you verified a signature from a specific place, like it can allow you to sort of chain different systems together. Then Basefold's really good for that because of the field agnosticity. Generally, I haven't yet tested it on like smaller fields like the 31-bit Mersenne prime, but I think there's promise there. And then also with the, as we were discussing, binary extension fields, it could be really good maybe for hashes that use the binary field. In general, I think this deconstruction of generator matrices I showed could lead to better protocols in general, because it sort of like frees up our mental model from only working in kind of dense algebraic subfields, and gives us like a playground where we can sort of switch out the values of the diagonal matrices, for example, and see what we get. So that's what I see.
Awesome. Wait, Hadas, are you saying something now? Because maybe we can't hear you.
No, I'm not.
Okay, cool.
Does anybody have other questions? I'm also, feel free to email me whenever if you have questions later.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. If you want to share your email,
Yeah.
cool.
Yes. Okay, here's my personal email.
All right, well, this was super informative, and Hadas, your slides absolutely rock. And this
Thanks.
explanation, I definitely learned a lot, and I hope you guys did too. Yeah, thank you again, Hadas.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Bye. Thank you all for coming.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.